Thank you for joining the Georgia Recovers October webinar titled The Both and of Recovery, Exploring Harm Reduction and Integrative Treatment. So our agenda for today will have a welcome and also go over some housekeeping rules. I'll talk a little bit about the Georgia Recovers campaign. I'll introduce our speaker, Olive, who will then present, and we will wrap up with a Q&A portion. So for housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded and a copy of the presentation will be available on the Georgia Recovers website. Once the recording is available, you all will also receive that via email directly from Teams. All attendees will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, but feel free to use the Q&A panel at the top of the screen if you have any questions that you would want us to answer during the Q&A portion. The chat is also available for any general commentary, but it won't be moderated as closely. So again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel. Our interpreter, Sarita, will remain spotlighted throughout the webinar. To adjust your view and to see all of the speakers, click the view in the right top corner of your screen, and you will be able to see the gallery of everyone. Feel free to also use our stream text link as well to access the transcription of the webinar. Okay, and on to Georgia Recovers campaign overview. So Georgia Recovers is an evidence-based public health campaign that's aimed to reduce the prejudice and discrimination associated with substance use disorder throughout Georgia. The campaign is brought to you by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities and builds off of the pivotal work of Georgia Council for Recovery. So we have a few objectives, including increasing knowledge about substance use disorder and that recovery is not only possible, but probable. We also seek to improve attitudes towards those living with and or in recovery from substance use disorder and strengthen the capacity of stakeholders, including organizations and individuals that are already responding to this. So we have a few pillars of work, including community connection, story sharing, and also education. So we connect with different community organizations across the state. We also have our CIC, which I see a few members are here, that help us guide the direction of the campaign and ensure that Georgia Recovers is reflecting the needs of the state. Story sharing is also a really huge aspect of the Georgia Recovers campaign. So we collect stories of recovery and allyship and then share them across our social media channels. Education is also really important. So we seek to change attitudes by promoting messaging that speaks to hope and recovery. And we also host bi-monthly webinars such as this one to shed light on topics related to substance use disorder. So there are a few ways to stay connected with the Georgia Recovers campaign, including sharing your story with us. So again, we collect stories of recovery and allyship. And if you are interested in sharing your story with us, Jody is going to share a link in the chat where we'll schedule an informational call just so you can learn a little bit more about the process. And then to the right, we have one of our quotes from one of our story sharers, Dina, who shared her story with her daughter, Riley. And she states that substance use disorder is not a moral deficiency, but a chronic brain disease. And then last but not least, feel free to connect with us on social media, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you're interested in becoming an official campaign partner, Jody is also going to include a link in the chat box as well. So on to our amazing speaker for today. So Olive Kirkpatrick is a passionate advocate for harm reduction and social justice who currently serves as the Director of Operations at Access Point of Georgia, a leading community-based harm reduction organization in Northeast Georgia. Olive understands the complexities surrounding substance use and has dedicated her work to promoting compassionate, evidence-based approaches that prioritize care, connection, dignity, and autonomy. She brings an eclectic bag of experience, expertise, and lived experience to the table with a knack for crafting supportive environments for people who use drugs to access care, connection, and community as a dose of preventative medicine. Currently, Olive oversees statewide initiatives focused on overdose prevention and naloxone distribution, working to blend harm reduction and more traditional and dominant treatment approaches for a more inclusive, effective, and compassionate response to people seeking healing for substance use disorder. I'm super excited to pass it on and feel free to take it away, Olive. Thank you so much.
Hello. I am we did a little pre-rundown before we got started, and so I'm still getting a little bit oriented because my main computer didn't quite agree, but I'm looking to see who else here, and I see some familiar names, so that's exciting. So I'm Olive. I am from Access Point of Georgia. We're a harm reduction community-based organization, so we're a little different than probably most of the people that you hear from. Um, and I met with Jayla and some others, but mostly Jayla, I think, during a town hall. And they were getting feedback on the campaigns and like the videos that were really great. Just we're very like, we're graceful recipients of feedback that we would love to see more harm reduction representation in recovery campaigns and media campaigns for awareness and prevention and recovery and treatment and all of those things. Because there's a lot of really, some of those I'll talk about in specifics if you want to hear more about them. But really, I want to kind of get across what harm reduction is really about. Because there are a lot of really important evidence-based interventions that come from the harm reduction movement. I'll explain the movement versus the strategies in a minute. And some really important ways that they work really beautifully with, and also were probably born together with abstinence-based recovery. So, harm reduction also does include abstinence-based recovery. It's not in opposition at all, despite stigma and all the things that people want us to kind of think to, not be on the same page. It's like the most extreme form of harm reduction, some people say. So I am going to pull up my slides here and see if I can get them all to screen share in one go. But where are you guys joining from? I'll try to keep an eye on the chat without getting too off base if I can help myself. Is everybody in Georgia? I think all the names that I recognize are in Georgia for sure. And I would be curious to see how many of you guys are already familiar with harm reduction. Are you here? Oh, Lawrenceville, that's where I was raised, born and raised. Oh, hey, Dudley. Yeah, born and raised in Lawrenceville, just about 45 minutes up the road from where I live now. I live in Athens. Okay, Athens, Georgia is where I'm at. Another Lawrenceville, love it. The downtown, they've really revitalized it. They said they would, and they sure did. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay. Let's see if it'll let me do it. Open it up. Oh no. Okay. One moment here.
And Olive, I can go ahead and share our merge deck if that works for you. Let me know what you need.
I think that, well, you know what? Okay. I'm gonna get on the other computer. I'm coming. I'm just gonna turn this way a little bit, I think. If it'll let me. Okay. All right, let's see if that's better. Oh, shoot. It's because I did the wrong, there we go. Okay. Sorry about this, y'all. Despite Jayla's very, very best efforts, still get in here. Okay. You can still, yep. Yes, you can use the display. Is it sharing yet?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay. Enter full screen. Okay. All right, so you can see that just fine. Are you seeing one at a time?
Nope, we're seeing multiple slides.
Okay. Well, there we go.
There we go.
There we go. There's one. Okay. Good night. All right. Well, I am gonna just pop up here really quick. I usually like to sit on the floor if I'm doing stuff like this, but we'll sit up here. Okay, let me kind of get a handle. So where does it kind of look like everybody's from? Is everybody kind of from Atlanta area, like Metro? Let's see. Okay, well, Kentucky, my goodness. Okay, so all right, I'm going to talk about, there was a lot of different ways that I was thinking about presenting this to you guys, and I sent Jill a couple options. And so I wanted to talk about some distinctions, right? So harm reduction is not just like strategies and services, right? We've got, you know, a lot of buzz about harm reduction right now, especially with the opioid funding that's been coming down. There's a lot of it that's allotted for harm reduction funding. And there's some good reasons for that, especially for like the services that are really have a really strong evidence base, are really effective for preventing death, right? So that's a big priority of, and as it should be, of, you know, committees and the little groups, the powers that be that make the decisions around where the funding goes. You know, opioid fatality is something that they're kind of constantly keeping as a priority to try to mitigate. And they've been doing that for a long time. So we know that there's some things we can do there, right? Without preventing it in general. So like use prevention also exists on a spectrum, right? We'll get there. I'm getting ahead of myself. But I want to talk about the concept of like a both and approach. I don't know if any of you guys have heard this language before, but it's language that I really like and resonates with me, that like, you know, both things can be true at the same time, right? We can be advocates for abstinence-based recovery and also advocates for, oh, somebody in Athens. What's up, neighbor? And also advocates for harm reduction. We can be advocates for recovery just as much as we can be advocates for people who use drugs or choose to consume substances. And I just would love to see more of that conversation be at the forefront of any conversation that's around substance use and its effects, the wider harms of the war on drugs, and as it relates to recovery as well, right? So we know that there's stigma too, even in recovery, as people enter recovery through whatever pathway that they choose. So I would love to see more conversation. What I'm aiming to do here is have a conversation about integrating what we call harm reduction principles. You know, harm reduction is a philosophy, it's a framework, it's a set of values, a set of principles. You could say it any of those ways. And from that was born a set of services that now exists in what they call the continuum of care. So I'm going to kind of walk you through that. But to introduce you to me, so I think connection is the best prevention. It's something I've been saying over and over lately, as you know, we're talking about mitigating opioid fatality, trying to reduce deaths from opioid overdose. And naloxone, you guys might know it as Narcan, has been a big part of that conversation for a long time. And so we can do a lot with naloxone in terms of distributing it, getting it in the right hands. We have a model, one of the programs that I'm overseeing is a naloxone saturation program. So it's not just about distributing it in widespread, like wide spray. It's about really focused distribution to people who use drugs and their social networks. So we're looking at where are people the most likely to experience an opioid overdose and most likely to need an intervention so that they don't die. And so those are the areas that we're looking at. So we're looking at, our data from the people that we serve. For one, we serve in general people who are in pretty active use of some kind or another. We also serve people who are in varying stages of moderation or entering recovery, or maybe, having a return to use, or all those things. But we do have a pretty heavy load of people who are in active use and have fallen through the cracks of the care continuum, right? We call them cracks, but they're really like pretty big canyons in between, stepping stones for people to get to a place of recovery. And those people need a pretty heavy saturation, a pretty heavy wraparound of naloxone around them to make sure that if or when there's an overdose, there's naloxone present in order to restore breathing. We won't do a naloxone training today, but if you would like one, please let me know. Overdose is about the breath. Naloxone is restoring the breath. So something good to remember. So that concept of connection being the best prevention, because comes from that, because no one can breathe for you, do rescue breathing, use naloxone if they're not there. So if someone's experiencing an opioid overdose because they're using alone and no one's there to use naloxone to even spot that they're experiencing an opioid overdose, there's not a chance there. So the best chance we've got really for mitigating opioid fatality isn't naloxone, it's connection with each other. And it's keeping these people that are at high risk, closer with us. So, something really sad happens a lot when people experience a return to use or a relapse, if that's the language you use, a setback. And we're always trying to move forward with our language, person first, and trying to get out of that self-shame too, that internalized stigma, internalized shame around what we've been taught to think about use, what our own use might have looked like. And it's just so important to, focus on the people who are having that experience and bring them closer. They need connection more than ever, right? They don't need to be more alone, or I'm pretty sure the heap of shame that they feel is already quite enough. They probably don't need our help with that. So that's something I would love to see more of. And I have a fun project coming up soon that maybe some of you guys will get involved in. If you stay up on our email list, you'll hear about it soon enough. But yeah, so I'm with Access Point. I want to introduce you to Access Point a little bit. Access Point, we're a harm reduction organization. So we offer some services and, interventions and prevention measures and things that you're probably familiar with, that you probably also have a lot of bias around perhaps. So we have a syringe service program. So where we offer sterile syringes to people who are injection users. And so that's, reducing the spread of infections. People aren't using or reusing or sharing syringes. So bloodborne viruses, diseases like HIV and Hep C. Also soft tissue infections. We do biohazard removal. So we get, used syringes off the street, even if they're not from our people. People return their syringes when they come back. And then what that becomes is an engagement point for people to access other services. So if they need to access services for testing, for treatment, we do a lot of linking to care for hepatitis C or testing for hepatitis C, relinking people to care for HIV, people who have fallen out of care for one reason or another. And So we're kind of looking at those like community things community care about, right? Like we want to reduce the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. Where we live here, our rates are skyrocketing. So these are, good things in that way, but they're also good things in that they get us to be able to connect with people. And it gives these people a place to go with no judgment, no coercion. We're never going to coerce them to do anything they don't want to do, trick them into treatment, nothing like that. So they get to kind of come in and have a deep breath and sit with some people, and we just get to, get them what we can. Sometimes that's just sitting next to them and listening. A lot of the time, that's what it is. Sometimes we can't do anything other than that, depending on the circumstance. And that's where I call it sometimes harm reduction just for today, which some of y'all might get that. So where this comes from, right? So this is important. And I'm like, probably should have talked about this before syringe exchange, but in the harm reduction movement, it's a movement. So we've got capital HR harm reduction, which is what we call ourselves, like movement harm reductionists, right? Like I'm a harm reductionist in that way, regardless of whether or not I work at Access Point. Then we have like the lowercase, the little r, little hr harm reduction, which is like the interventions and the strategies that come from that movement. So how this started as we know it right now, right? The United States history in recent times. There's harm reduction has existed long before this and many other cultures as a means for survival, right? Disproportionately affected, marginalized groups of people have always had a movement, a principled, shared set of values around how they take care of each other and take care of themselves and stay alive. So the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, that's the roots of the harm reduction movement as we know it now. So we've got grassroots efforts at that time, initiating services on their own, like syringe exchange, accessing clean syringes, establishing programs, working sort of outside of the legal lines in order to keep each other safe and to keep each other alive. As I don't know how old some of you guys are, but I was pretty young at that time. I was born in 85. So in the early 90s, when it was still a death sentence really to get diagnosed with HIV. I remember my teachers. I don't remember knowing people that had HIV, but I do remember my teacher saying it's okay to hug people that have HIV. Princess Diana did it on the TV, and I'm like, what? Like, why are they talking about this? And just being pretty confused. Learning a lot about like, no, you can't get it from hugging. No, you can't get it from holding hands, and learning a lot about how it was transmitted. So then we also at the same time, we have these campaigns, these public campaigns, the Just Say No campaign. We've got programs, drug and sex education programs, DARE, right? At the same time, all this is happening. So we've got like stigma production, disproportionately affected people, and like the chasm just keeps getting farther and farther apart, right? And kind of the same way that like our treatment system is. We have people that we've got abstinence-based driven treatment across the board, and especially in this part of the country, right? Over here. And we've got use, like chaotic active use over here. And we're asking those people to jump all the way over here with nothing else in between. And so these people fall and they fall and they fall in the cracks. So somewhere down here, hopefully you're being caught by other services or other people or other movements. And the idea is not just that we catch them and keep them there. The idea is that we catch them and hopefully boost them back up and hopefully help to create some softer landings for people so they're not falling through the cracks so much. So harm reduction's role, when we're talking about in this context, like we provide, it's non-judgmental, non-coercive. Those are some of the principles. So of the principles, there's about 8. I should probably get to that, right? There's 8 principles. We've got, here we go with the movement. So this is where we're talking about movement versus the strategies, right? It's a focus on social justice. It's a focus on populations that are disproportionately affected. So people who, you know, and especially when we see these like intersecting identities, right? Where we have, I don't know that any of our people that we serve have, they all have a ton of things intersecting that put them at a disadvantage. And especially a disadvantage for accessing support and accessing care. So the movement itself focuses on those things. It's focusing on people not having autonomy in their care services, on basic human rights and dignity, support without judgment, you know, safety, support, all of those things. So you can probably just distill them into four: is, you know, dignity, autonomy, safety, support. And then we've got one that I think is important to name in terms of the way that people think about harm reduction. We're not saying like, yay, go use drugs. Like, people should be able to use drugs anytime they want, anywhere they want, any way they want, licit or illicit, and like, you know, rah, keep going, use drugs. No, what we're saying is it happens. So pragmatism and realism is a principle that I particularly love. I feel very much like a realist most of the time. Most of the time. Sometimes I'm an idealist, but you know, people use drugs. We know that it happens. And so what are we going to do? You know, there is harm associated with that use for a lot of people and for a lot of communities. Sometimes that harm is community wide. Sometimes it's, you know, just an individual's health, right? And it's depending on the substance, depending on how that substance is used, depending on where it's used, in what setting, you know, with who we have something we talk about drug set setting. So it's risk set setting. And in this case, the risk is the drug, right? So what is the drug? What's the mindset the person's in that's taking it? What's the setting? Are they alone? Are they with people? Are they with people that care about them? Are they with people they can be honest with? Are they with people who would intervene if they needed to, if something bad happened, and they could do something about it? You know, we know that that's not always the case, right? Most opioid overdoses, there is a bystander nearby. Someone could have intervened, right? In a lot of cases, they don't. Some because they don't know that it's happening. They're in a room with the door closed. So yes, there's a bystander, but they're technically still alone. Or in some cases, you know, the person won't intervene. They think they're teaching them a lesson. That's a pretty devastating one to hear from time to time. Luckily, less and less as time goes on. Hopefully with more stigma reduction, that will help. But we need, you know, we need both the things, right? We need the realism, we need autonomy, we need participant-centered ideas about how to help people. We need to hear from them what they say would be helpful. But we also need practical strategies. That's also realistic. Like, we need to know what's working. What is the evidence base? So, you know, for naloxone, we've had the evidence base for naloxone for a long time. We know it works. We know it's a pure antidote to opioid overdose. Actually, the access history of naloxone is pretty fascinating and can teach you a lot about harm reduction, and will teach you a lot too about systemic barriers to care. So having something like naloxone that's a pure antidote, that there's a quote in this book. This is a history of the American harm reduction movement as we know it now in the U.S. born from the HIV/AIDS crisis. And they said, you know, in order for you to hurt yourself or someone else with naloxone, you would have to shatter the bottle and cut your wrist with it. Like, that's how safe it is. It's, you know, if you're not experiencing an opioid overdose and you inject yourself with naloxone in your butt, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to die. Nothing. I mean, you'd have to be like the freak one person in the world that's like allergic to it or something, you know. But it's a very safe medication, and that it's been so difficult to get wide access to, because it's for people who use drugs, is sad and infuriating. And it's like such an injustice. Like the more I learn about access to naloxone, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is real. This is like a documentary. Every step, every anything I learned could be its own documentary. Um, so we need some practical ways to get around that, right? So then that's where we have people who are into policy, people who are into advocacy, people who are like super into going to the Capitol. That's not me. Couldn't be me. I don't want to do that. But I'm glad that there are those people. Because what they do is they help us with these things, right? The gaps and the opportunities in our traditional treatment models, and then where we can look and see where there's really great injustice in terms of what's not available for people in care, and figure out how we can meet those things. How can we advocate for policy change? How can we look at current policy and see where actually we could implement some harm reduction strategies that we know work? Those are the things that I love to do. If you have peers that you work with, I think many of you probably are peers. Peers can get creative. That's what my partner, who's our founder, Riley, founded Access Point, and he was one of the first harm reduction syringe service users probably back in the 90s on the West Coast, and then now to this day, seeing it, it's barely even a thing here. Just the way that things are so different in time. It's almost like we're living in different time periods through, not depending on where you are in the country. But I was able to kind of watch him as a peer make things work and make things happen for the people that he was working with that so desperately needed care and had been locked out of it for so long, mostly because of stigma and mostly because of punitive policies that are rooted in stigma. I was looking at Shatterproof's website last night just to kind of familiarize myself again with their priorities and looking for different things to suggest in terms of harm reduction. But I love that there is such an explicit statement of stigma hurts people. And I mean, stigma and misinformation are deadly as hell. They are the root of so much harm. So really reducing stigma is such a huge priority. I think should be such a huge priority. Getting yourself around people who use drugs, it's not contagious, it's not, we have a lot of things that are contagious, but that's not one. I know we have different ways we think about use and substance use, and those things can be hard, especially for a person in recovery, and your recovery looks that way for you. But how can we, maybe there are things you can do that don't involve you being close to someone who's using drugs, right? And also to be close to someone who's using drugs, you don't have to, I never watch someone use drugs, but I work with them all the time. I'm around them all the time. The difference is they have a presence of a substance inside of their bloodstream that I don't have. That's the difference, So let's see. So we've got the philosophical roots. It's just kind of repeating, right? We're looking at all these strategies come from those roots. They come from, these principles that say, where's the dignity here? People deserve dignity, period products, right? Or for menstruation, those products that's about dignity, right? And not having access to those, they're expensive. Not having access to supplies like that is a dignity issue. Autonomy and self-determination, being able to lead, be in the driver's seat of your own life. What does that mean for people? I was talking to someone and, kind of getting him to understand those principles in terms of applying them. He works in a different kind of program where he's got a lot more measures that he's got to work with. There's a lot more bureaucracy kind of tied up in things. And he was talking about going to the mailbox and waiting for his pardon letter every day. And I was like, what would that mean to you to have that? And he was telling me why he needed it. And I was like, no, I know why you need it. You know what I mean? To get these things, get over these hurdles, but what would it mean to you? And, eventually he was like, well, then I wouldn't have this hanging over me, in so many words. And I was like, yeah, it would liberate you from this kind of nonsensical thing at this point. That's really just a matter of a piece of paper saying whether or not you're worthy of making decisions about your life moving forward. That's a principle. So that's a lot of what some of those strategies are born from too. People being able to say with their own voice and their own mind, this is where I want to go, and this is how I want to get there. So we need both, right? So this is the same with both and. Like, so much of this is both and. We need both abstinence-based recovery for the people that need it, and we need harm reduction for the people that need it. We need abstinence-based recovery for people who just want it, right? We need, for people that want that kind of community. We need, and maybe it's a part of their value system, right? We need harm reduction because we have communities, right? We have communities. Our behavior ripples out, whether we like it or not. So we need harm reduction measures in place to be able to make sure that no behavior gets too top heavy, that it's toppling over into a community, and that if so, that we can rectify those things. But the best practice also, it's like we can believe. I hear a lot, I don't believe in that stuff. I'm like, well, you don't have to believe in it because there's an evidence base for it. So same thing with you don't have to believe in astrology. The stars are still there. The blueprint in the sky is still there, whether we believe it or not. So, same with this. It's both of these together is what creates the evidence base. So when we're seeing, syringe exchange pop up in health departments everywhere and different organizations, it is the principled part there, because what we're trying to do as a public health community is take the strategies that were born from the roots of the movement, and is what makes the evidence so strong. It's what makes them so effective. SSPs in terms of recovery, right? There's all these statistics that have been, reproduced time and time again, that people who engage with an SSP of the syringe service program are 5 times more likely to enter any kind of treatment. And from there, they're 10 times more likely to stay in long-term recovery. I mean, it's it just exponentially increases, but it's not the syringe, right? It's who's giving them the syringe and how they're giving it to them. So you can give someone syringes, clean syringes, but you can do that with a lot of shade and a lot of hatred toward people who use drugs regardless. We have a woman who's taught us sometimes, she says, you can do it with, she's British, you can do it with a heap of shame, and so there's a lot of different ways to serve someone with something, right? Just like there's a lot of different ways to, give someone you can give someone a compliment, but depending on the spirit in which it's given is different. So the spirit in which the strategies are provided very much influences how effective they're going to be. Not just how someone feels, that's important, but how effective they're going to be. So if what we say is that we care about long-term recovery, whatever that might look like. Yeah, Dudley, y'all in Alabama is archaic. My gosh. The naloxone laws in Alabama. This is an interesting. So Alabama, they can't have one of our distributors that we work with where we get our naloxone. We have a harm reduction nonprofit pharma company, if you can believe it or not, that exists now, that created a new nasal product called Revive. So that's it's like Narcan, but a different name. Because Narcan's just a name. It's just a brand. And they bought it from harm reduction, by the way. It was an injectable product before, and then Emergent bought it and made it nasal and made millions and millions and millions of dollars off of the deaths of drug users and their friends and their families, and pretty sad. So anyway, Alabama, we decided as a group, basically, for the free doses that were going to be available to the grassroots organizations, of which we're one, we allotted those to Alabama because they can't have injectable naloxone, all kinds of chaos and criminalization, jail time, and whatever lies in Alabama, and it's archaic. That's where I went to college. Actually, I went to Auburn. It's crazy there. I thought I grew up in the South, growing up in Lawrenceville. No, it is not. Going to Alabama, I realized a few things. I won't tell her story because I might actually cry. Systemic, legal, social obstacles. These are barriers to harm reduction, right? It's all just stigma. It's all just the way that Riley puts it, who's our founder and my partner, is we don't have a word for the way that people hate people who use drugs. We have words for things like misogyny and transphobia and homophobia and racism. and systemic racism. And like we have an idea of what systemic forms of violence might take shape like, but we don't have a word for what that is when we're talking about people who use drugs. And that's so true. And might be the lowest on the totem pole, except if you have HIV, it puts you just at the very bottom. And so those are, you know, a lot of the people that we work with are in that category. Now, there are also people who have been around and around and around the treatment cycle, right? They've been to the treatment centers, they've been to the sober living houses, they've worked with these social workers, they've worked in these organizations, these bureaucracies, these, you know, all these things, the crisis units. And, you know, because we get a lot of people who are like, well, have you tried this with your people? And I'm like, what do you mean your people? They're your people too. Like, you know, you served them also at one point, and you know, they fell off the crack into the canyon there too. And it's like, it's not for any of our faults. It's, we're all a part of the system, right? And so what can we do to strengthen? I've been calling it a colander of support, because I'm like, we can't really right now, we don't have a framework to truly have like a tightly woven fabric to like catch people who are just like tipping into this canyon of lack of care over and over and over, to be able to boost them back up. We're just like hoping that the colander doesn't have too many big holes underneath that, and trying our best to find the people who we don't have to drag to care, but that already do care and that want to do something about it. You know, so how harm reduction benefits recovery? I'll just kind of like wrap it up, because I feel like I see some questions somewhere, but you know, we've got social benefits like, whoa, like, do you guys all have a best friend? I'm sure that, like, you know, you can tell anything to, that you can be honest with, that like when you need to have the pressure valve release, you know where to go. And you know, how much does that increase your trust with that person? Like, what does your trust look like when you know you can't be honest about what you're doing with your doctor? You know, I grew up in a really purity-based like culture around drug and sex education. And so I had behaviors that like I would consider risky at this point. You know, looking back on my life, I'm like, oh my, like I feel like such a prude sometimes looking at my like 17-year-old self, like, oh geez, what was I doing? I had no idea, because no one taught me. And, you know, all we were taught was just like, drugs are bad, you'll get HIV and you'll die, you know. And unfortunately, though, that is actually a thing that does happen still in this day and age, depending on what kind of access you have to services, treatment, money, transportation, the social determinants of health, shall we say. But we've got, you know, reduced overdose deaths, right? That's a good one. We're starting to finally see that number go down. It might be too soon to say whether or not that's a sustainable trajectory downward. That's a policy thing if you're in a policy, and that's a way that you want to be involved in making change with things in recovery spaces. We got to get on the policy train, because naloxone's never going to do it. It won't. Naloxone is not a solution to opioid fatality. It's a really good intervention that we have. It's a pure antidote. It's the best we've got, but it's not going to solve the problem and get people. It's not going to get people into long-term recovery any faster. So other things might, you know, that connection piece might, like sitting with someone and really offering them a safe place to land, that might. You know, improve mental health. Yeah, I mean, get around people, and people that you trust, and people that tell you you can really be honest with them. Yeah, that would improve my mental health. Engagement and treatment. So you know, harm reduction, so many of the services are an engagement point. Even things like offering pipes to people who are inhaling their substances, that's a huge engagement tool. You know, meeting people who are the most locked out of care because of the stigma. I mean, even amongst drug users, y'all, the stigma is insane. They're like the crack smokers versus the opioid injectors versus like they all think each other's thing is, you know, crazy. They're like, no, crack is whack. No, that's whack. You know, they're all it exists everywhere. This is not even just from the people to people who use drugs. It's to people who use drugs themselves, because there's so much of that internalized shame and stigma too. So getting people to trust you to help them be safer about smoking a substance takes a minute. Like our stimulant smokers are knit up tight, and for good reason, you know, for good reason. They're criminalized all the way there and back. So this is a quote from Shiro-san. I'm going to read this and then I'm going to stop so that we can do questions. But this is, what harm reduction really is about to me. Harm reduction is about building systems of care outside the frameworks of punishment and oppression. It's about meeting people where they are without judgment and creating pathways to survival, healing, and justice. And I just think that's a beautiful way to think about it and talk about it. And it's care, it's connection, it's community. That's what it is. It's about building systems of care. It's about falling in love with each other's survival, as she says, and doing what we need to do for each other. And sometimes that's a literal just for today thing, or just for this moment. And, that's all we can do. And sometimes it's restoring someone's breath with naloxone and saving their life. So, yeah, I'm going to stop there and see if there's anything I can answer that might help. It's so hard to fit it in.
Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground, Olive, and we really appreciate your expertise and really how you broke things down. One of my favorite kind of parts of your presentation is how you set the like foundation of a both and, right? Like two things can
Yeah.
be true at the same time, and we can support the spectrum of recovery. So I really appreciate that perspective. So hopping into our first question, um, can you share examples of successful advocacy efforts that have led to policy changes in harm reduction?
Let me go grab my notes really quick. I just realized I left them.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I absolutely can. Yeah, there's a ton when we're looking at like successful advocacy or successful. I just don't want you guys have to see me running, running away from you. When we're looking at like successful, there's such a very like vast wealth of examples and like precedent for all manner of ways in which people get shit done, basically. We've got, okay, even looking at, so naloxone access actually is a good one. That's what I was, I just don't even know where to start sometimes. I get like too caught up and too excited and also too mad. But when we're like naloxone access, there's so much that had to happen and still actually has to happen for it to be like sustainably available for people to access no matter what. Is first we had to have, okay, you guys remember COVID, right? And the standing order for vaccinations, right? They'd have a standing order for that because it hadn't technically gone through all of the proper routes and channels to like not have to have that. So they had to get a doctor who was like insane enough to be publicly seen supporting people who use drugs, accessing a medication that would save their life should they die because of their use or like start to not breathe because of their use. And finding a doctor who would do that was incredibly difficult, and still is, honestly. Like when we're thinking about who's going to put their name on the line on a standing order, saying, yep, people who use drugs can access this medication, period. And so we've got that now over the counter for nasal naloxone. Injectable naloxone still is like, it's like in a standing order situation. We don't have like, it's still, and it's the cheapest, right? We've got the difference between, I don't have, well, I'm sure I do have one somewhere around me, but I won't do that. The vials of naloxone cost $1.50 basically for one dose, right? So we put 2 in a kit. Let's call it at most, that kit costs $4 at cost. And the nasal, that cost is going to be like $28 at its very cheapest in this moment. That's a big difference. When we're looking at the cost to save a life, we're looking at the cost to mitigate opioid fatality. We're saying that's a priority. Why are we spending so much money on nasal? Why aren't we spending more money getting the standing order just like over the counter? Like, what do we need to do? Good Samaritan laws, that's, advocacy all the way for the Good Samaritan laws. Most states, I think most states have them. They're all different depending on the state. There's still advocacy that needs to be done around the Good Samaritan law here to make sure that it's truly actually working for the people who are reversing overdoses. So people who use drugs reverse almost 90% of all overdose reversals. That's like people who use drugs are saving people who use drugs, right? I think we love to think about like literally as a good Samaritan, like, oh, you're just walking down the street and like you just save someone from an overdose. And that does happen sometimes. I see actually one of our folks is on this call, and so if she wants to talk about it, she can, but I won't call her out on it. But she, you know, she saw someone falling out at the gas station and, you know, used naloxone and he lived. He or she, I'm not sure. That was a handful of months ago, or maybe that was, gosh, that might have been last year. You know, it does happen, but it's not normal. And probably also really not normal because you probably don't usually have like a harm reduction worker walking around with the people. So, you know, that's one for sure. We need it to actually protect people because there's a lot of limitations on it, right? So if people are already experiencing carceral consequences of their use, so they're on probation, or something like that, or if they've had a return to use or something, like this is a relapse situation for them, and they have a quantity that is over what's considered a personal amount, it like doesn't apply. In some states, it only applies one time. You can use it one time. I'm like, what? Okay. And we know that when someone overdoses, they're more likely to overdose again. So it just doesn't make sense. Medication assisted treatment expansion, you know, there's so many. I have a lot written down, but those are core ones. Yeah.
And speaking of, like, you're speaking to access and also stigma and how they interplay in all of these policies. Speaking of, right, we have a lot of like community focused people that are attending today. So thinking about how can we talk about MAT and the stigma around that in recovery? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And its controversy, yeah.
I mean, honestly, some of it, I think y'all are just gonna have to get sassy and say it's not nobody's business. Like, I think some of it is, honestly, actually, I do think a lot of it is addressing the surveillance culture in certain circles of recovery. That in understanding that surveilling each other doesn't work. It doesn't keep people in recovery. If anything, it just increases and heightens that the navel gazing already that people are doing, thinking they're so bad, right? It's like, you know, that's one. That's complicated though, and I understand that. Two, educating people, educating yourself, being able to talk. Honestly, probably the strongest thing you can do is be able to talk fluently about what it is that you're trying to dismantle. So, like, and understanding how that stigma has come to be. Because if we don't know where the stigma is coming from, and we don't know why do they think that, why do they have such a bias against methadone or Suboxone? Why are they, why is it seen for this person to be a crutch and not a useful medication for a dependence? Those kind of things. Understanding the difference between what we call addiction and what is dependence in the brain. And a lot of people like to use they like to say, insulin and diabetes. It's like, find ways to say it that aren't just repeating what you've heard. Like, get in practice with yourself and other people, like debating ideas. I know that's the thing that people don't like to do anymore. Like, we don't like to debate ideas, but that's how good ideas get out, and that's how good ideas last, and we don't suffer with bad ones for too long, hopefully. But yeah, that'd be my biggest advice, honestly. But knowing who you're talking to, because I call it being multilingual, right? Like, the way that I'm talking to you guys today would be very different than the way that I'm talking to someone who, like, maybe doesn't even understand substance use at all, period. Or versus the way that I'm talking to, like, our participants and the people who use drugs, like, in that language. Like, but if I'm around them, like, this conversation is totally different. Like at outreach, it's like you almost can't even understand what each one of us is saying because we're using language that, like, is really unique to them. And we let them lead with that. And that's cultural competence, right? Like, I'm mirroring what they're doing, being aware,
Meeting them where they're at. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Olive, that at least what I'm gathering is there's still work to be done on every level, right? Like interpersonally, the way that we speak to others about substance use disorder, recovery, harm reduction. And also there are systemic changes that need to happen, right? Even Dudley in the chat mentioned, in my opinion, until we're willing to spend the money on treatment instead of incarceration, we're just holding a pattern, which is also a really great perspective. So I wanted to kind of round out the conversation as we're coming up on the end of our webinar, but I love the fact that you've gotten some conversation going, and hopefully if there is anything else that people want to discuss, they can directly contact you, and I'll make sure that they have the information that they need. But after this, everyone will receive a recording of the webinar. But I wanted to thank you so much, Olive, for your time, and also Sarita for your services as well. So thank you all so much for joining, and we'll see you all in 2 months.
Yeah. Oh, and I see people saying stuff about naloxone. We do have a statewide mail. We can mail naloxone to you, and we're in Northeast Georgia as our service area, but we'll ship it. If you need naloxone, let us know. We'll get it to you.
Tell them about the hour tomorrow.
Oh yeah, you can come and ask questions tomorrow. We have every Thursday at 1:00. We have an hour. You can just drop in and do Q&A. So if you got questions and you're available tomorrow at 1, hop on Zoom with me. It'll be very casual.
Sounds great. And Olive, go ahead and send me that information, and I can forward it to our attendees for tomorrow.
All right.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar and see you all in 2 months. Bye.